Look, here's another case of federal versus state powers to regulate the economy. This is much like Obamacare. Think of it. A federal court, for the third time in as many months, swatted the EPA efforts to halt the greatest technology and energy boom this country has seen in many decades. It has to do with fracking, the drilling of natural gas using high-pressure water. Let's get some fracking facts, if I get that right. Some fracking facts from our friend Brian Shackman. He joins us now with the details. Good evening, Brian.
Hey, Larry. Keep it PG-13, right? Late last week, the EPA withdrew its lawsuit against Range Resources that alleged water contamination west of Fort Worth, Texas. As Larry said, it's yet another setback in its intense scrutiny on fracking. And even today, we learned that rules on emissions will be further delayed another 2 weeks. There's a lot of confusion about fracking, so I want to give a quick refresher. This is an animation from oil drilling in the Bakken. They actually execute a series of small explosions after they drill down. And what they do is they actually call it perforating. Fissures all the way throughout the well, every single few feet. Then under intense pressure, a combination of water, sand, or ceramics, along with some chemicals, are pushed into the well. And you see those. Those are the thousands of cracks that are propped open by them, allowing the oil and gas to flow up to the surface. Now, the concern here is water. The worry is over contamination of groundwater. Now, most energy companies I speak with say that if that happens, the operator is at fault, not the process. It shouldn't happen. But there's also water used in the fracking itself. That's not usable on the back end and often is simply stored underground. Today, there's no technology able to return that water to the system, and that's why there's such a fuss over the chemicals actually used in fracking. Companies, this is clear, this has to be clear, they're not arguing against regulation. The good operators actually want the regulation. They just don't want hasty decisions like a fracking moratorium, for instance. That would absolutely, Larry, frighten these companies.
And they also want to preserve the authority of state regulators who have the same environmental studies. Anyway, Brian Shackman, thanks very much. Now, my pal Jim Cramer also been thinking about the EPA and fracking, and he says today's decision may point the way to a less adversarial process that could free up this energy sooner. Jim?
Hey, Larry, maybe the EPA is beginning to recognize that natural gas fracking isn't as dangerous to drinking water that many in the agency may have thought. That's my real takeaway from the EPA's decision last week to back away from its slamming of Range Resources for allegedly polluting drinking water wells in Texas. Look, the EPA has been on a one-agency wrecking crew for months now against the process of fracking to bring up to the surface difficult-to-drill shale oil and gas. The agency had seemed determined to try to stop fracking by prejudging the whole process. In fact, I've often felt as if the EPA decided to take its marching orders from Gasland, a movie passing itself off as a documentary that presented so-called conclusive that fracking causes your drinking water to catch on fire. Last year, the EPA sued Range, one of the most responsible oil and gas companies in the country, for polluting water in a rural Texas county. But on Friday, the EPA went back on the lawsuit, basically admitting that there was no linkage between Range's fracking and the contamination. At the same time, the EPA acknowledged that it needs to retest the results of a fracking case recently brought in Wyoming, where the agency was quick to fold Encana, another responsible actor for polluting drinking water. Could this be the beginning of a less adversarial, more thoughtful EPA that isn't out to stop an amazing process that's been used more than 1 million times in this country without one instance of polluted water until the EPA ginned up these examples? Let's hope so. I had feared that the EPA was on the verge of saying, let's just stop fracking entirely until we know for certain how bad it is. Now it looks like the EPA has recognized that maybe it's not so bad after all. 2 cheers for an agency that had let anti-fossil fuel ideology get in the way of rational thinking. Let's hope that the EPA will be willing to leak positive findings about fracking as well as negative ones now that it recognizes that the negatives weren't based on fact, just on bias. Back to you, Lawrence.
All right, many thanks, Jim Cramer. I agree with most of that. I agree with all of that. Let me just get this straight. The White House apparently wants no Keystone oil pipeline, and the EPA risks not wanting any fracking. The rest of the country, meanwhile, disagrees with these federal mistakes. Let's talk about it. We have Dan Lashoff from the Natural Resources Defense Council, Barry Smitherman, chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission, which regulates oil, gas, and pipelines in Texas. Barry, it really was the federal court that pinned EPA's ears back, saying that you, at the state level, can do your own safety and environmental regulation. Wasn't that the key? It wasn't EPA voluntarily.
It was the key, Larry. You're exactly right.
And where do you go from here? In other words, what does this mean? Is this become a states' rights issue? Similarly in Wyoming, Pennsylvania, is this a major breakthrough that will keep EPA out of the over-regulation of fracking and oil and gas shale?
Hopefully the EPA will now defer to state regulators on these important issues. State regulators know better than the EPA what the underground geology is like and what the operators are doing. We understand the fracking process, and we know that it's safe. So, yes, I hope that the EPA has changed their mind and will now let states who are best equipped, like the Texas Railroad Commission, to do this adequately.
Daniel Lashoff, some people say that the EPA is doing less science and more politics, and that now they're going to have to go back to doing more science, less politics, and more constitutionalism with states' rights. Where do you come out on this?
Well, look, Larry, I don't think EPA was ever about stopping fracking. I think that EPA believes, and I certainly believe, that Americans shouldn't have to trade safe drinking water for energy. You know, when it comes to our drinking water, Americans would rather be safe than sorry. And what we need, as we have a system of federalism, is a set of minimum, sensible federal safeguards that the industry should have to comply with around the country. You know, the gas industry has developed this fantastic technology. I mean, they can do amazing things. They should be able to comply with some basic safeguards to protect our drinking water. And that's all we're asking for. If this industry is so clean, why do they continue to seek exemptions and sustain exemptions from the Safe Drinking Water Act and the the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act? It just doesn't make sense.
But Barry Smith, I mean, you said from day one, you and your state group, the Texas Railroad Commission, that you know what's safe and you know what's not safe. And other states have said the same thing. It seems to me that's the key to this EPA decision. The onus, the regulation goes back to the states, which are closest to the projects and have more expertise, frankly.
Absolutely right, Larry. There's never been a recorded case of fracking contaminating groundwater. States can take the lead in many of these areas. For example, Texas recently passed the first disclosure regulation, which requires all of our operators to disclose all the chemical ingredients that go into fracking, and it's posted on Frack Focus. We took the lead on that before the federal government ever thought about it.
But, Larry, shouldn't that requirement of basic disclosure be applied everywhere in the country? I mean, that's why we have federal standards for things like this. Nobody's saying that the states don't have a role here. Of course they do.
I think the problem is, look, Dan, I may not be an expert. You may know more about this than I do. But I think the problem is the EPA has a real agenda. They got too many bureaucrats there with a real agenda, and they want to stop any of these carbon fuels or fossil fuels. Look, they're doing it again on smog. Today they postponed some smog regulations on fracking. It's the fourth postponement, so maybe they're listening to what people are saying out there in the courts. But I don't know why the EPA has to pass on local smog decisions regarding fracking. That sounds like regulatory overkill and another backdoor way to kill fracking. Dan Lashoff, that's my problem with the EPA.
Well,
they're going way too far, way too often.
Well, I just don't think that's true when you look at the facts. I mean, oil and gas production are at all-time record highs. So if the EPA is out on some kind of agenda to stop fracking, they're doing a miserable job of it. I just don't think that's the case. The EPA's job is to protect our health and welfare, to make sure that we have safe air to breathe and clean water to drink. And that's what they're doing, and that's what Americans want EPA to do. By overwhelming majorities, Americans want EPA to be allowed to do its job of setting basic life-saving standards that provide a bottom line playing field that's level across the country.
Let me get Barry. Barry, quickly, can you take the last word on this?
Absolutely. The federal government did not invent fracking. Private enterprise invented fracking, and it's resulted in this incredible bounty of oil and gas that we now have that makes our country more secure and more viable going forward. States know how to handle these issues, and we do it in a way that doesn't create hysteria like the EPA does when it swoops in and makes unfounded allegations.
And this is one of the greatest technological and revolutionary developments probably in the history of energy, going all the way back to John D. Rockefeller in the 19th century. I mean, this is a remarkable thing that can help save America. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you.
Absolutely.
Daniel
Thank you.
Lashoff,
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your point of view. Barry Smitherman, thanks for coming on. Coming up on Kudlow, there